So in this chapter kind of wraps up the third part of this course. And I included this chapter because one of the kind of reigning debates, constant debates, was with the monetary system that was going to exist in the United States. If you remember all the way back to the colonial days, right? We had individual colonies issuing currencies that then was stopped once the Constitution was passed. But then, even when the federal government, the national government, had the power to print currency and mint coins, individual states still did that by having state banks issue those monies. And then, if you remember, we also had this kind of shift between either having a gold standard or a silver standard, and we ended up going with both when we had a very complicated bimetallism system. And after the Civil War, the Civil War, where there was especially high inflation in the Confederate States, and still a fair amount of inflation even in the northern states, for the most part, there was a realization, especially among farmers, those who were hit the worst by the deflation that occurred after the Civil War, was that it renewed the debate and the controversy surrounding the monetary system and what kind of standard we were going to have. For the most part, what you had is some class divisions where those who were lending money and those who were not farmers wanted some level of inflation, and farmers and those who had debts to others wanted, the farmers and the debtors, they wanted some level of inflation, and the non-farmers and the lenders, they were quite happy and they profited quite extensively from the deflation that existed. The issue, though, was that the financial system itself still needed to be developed further. And we don't really see until the eve of World War I that the Federal Reserve System starts to exist. Okay, so let's okay, so again, what we see here is that farmers were especially hurt by the deflation that existed in the 1870s and 1880s. And by the 1896 election with William Jennings Bryan, you don't finally get any resolution of what the currency is going to be based on in the United States. And this deflation largely defined the presidential election of 1896. And remember, too, at the same time, we also had a new form of currency existing, the greenback, if you remember that from 2 chapters ago. So we had monies that were based on a gold standard or a silver standard. Then you had states issuing currencies, and then you had the federal government issuing essentially a fiat currency, what would be called the greenback, which is not based on anything. And so what you see is that you've got a lot of different ways of understanding how money existed. And in fact, the book is a pretty good description, at least graphic, of all this. Okay, so look at this, right? So as we look in the years after the Civil War, out through the end of this time period that we're dealing with, I mean, look at this. So you've got the U.S. notes. The U.S. notes would be the greenbacks, right? So we see that if the government can print as much as it wants, it will print a lot, right? But then what you see again is during gold rushes, silver rushes. You see more gold coin and gold certificates, silver coins and silver certificates being printed. But then what you also see again are the national banknotes as well being issued. And so again, you just see a lot of different things being issued. The National Bank Act of 1863 had allowed, again, these national banks to issue currencies, so it even increased the risks of inflation even more. And what we also see is that these national banks, they were required to buy bonds in the amount of 1/3 of the capital stock they had. What these national banknotes also had to do is they had to have standard design with the bank name on them. What you're starting to see with these national banknotes is you're starting to see the beginnings of the formation of just a single national currency. Okay, let's go back to the slides. And so what you see then in slide 7, well, actually, let me, instead of just quickly summarizing, let me just talk about each of these slides. So again, the farmers are the ones that are affected the most by the deflation. And this is largely because they're also they're the buyer of things in a earlier time period. And so then the price to buy those things is going down over time. But then when the crop finally matures and they sell their crop, the prices have fallen even further. So, you know, their income is basically down while most of their expenses are going to be higher. Also, because of these farmers needing to buy the seed and buy all the materials in the beginning of the planting season, they oftentimes take on debt, and that debt burden becomes even more of a burden in a deflationary standpoint. So what we can see is that, again, this fact that deflation is occurring in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s is particularly problematic for farmers and is part of an element of a larger class warfare that emerges, which I guess would be this picture here. And so what you see, again, is that it kind of culminates in that 1896 election, presidential election, where William Jennings Bryan runs for election on a national policy of having a silver standard, and William McKinley ends up winning that presidency. That would be the Republicans, and the Republicans favored a gold standard. So what you see is that the western states and the southern states, those states where we did see a great deal of the agriculture occurring, all supported. They all supported the candidate for the Democrats, William Jennings Bryan, and that the East Coasters supported the Republican, William McKinley. And you get a pretty famous photograph of this, because they're probably not going to show it in the slides, but I do want to show this to you here. And you get this kind of photo here. So this would be William Jennings Bryan, who does one of kind of the first campaigns. Again, William Jennings Bryan does end up losing, but even as this caption to the photo shows, is that many of the ideas of William Jennings Bryan, where he was kind of defending the working class and the lower classes in society, many of those ideas end up being adopted during the New Deal by Franklin Roosevelt. Okay. And so, as I said, what we get in this time period of, let's say, 1870 to 1910, 1915, is we get this debate about the sound money. What does it mean to have sound money, and how do we actually achieve it? The desire for sound money is going to be strongest among those where there's deflation, because deflation is a much worse problem, and it causes all of these weird things to happen in terms of the timing of purchases. And what farmers wanted is, because the farmers wanted some level of inflation, they wanted the more plentiful silver to form as the base of the money. That way, again, you'd get more inflation than you would ever get with gold. On the other hand, right, the Republicans with William McKinley did want a return of the gold standard, with the idea that it was safer, but it would also have a lower inflation rate attached to it. Okay. What we see here, in terms of, what is good and what is bad about having a gold standard, in general, a gold standard is not something that's encouraged or desired by economists. And again, we don't have any countries that exist today that have a gold-based security, a commodity-based currency. And the reason why is because you don't really know, you can't really alter the amount of money supply that exists in order to achieve some economic goal or fix some economic problem. Something that becomes even more pronounced when John Maynard Keynes comes on the scene in the 1930s, in 1936, with his text Theory of Money and Interest, where he basically is saying that you would use monetary policy to alter the output levels in the economy. Well, the only benefit you get out of the gold standard is then you don't really have to worry about managing the money supply. Nature will do that by the amount of gold that you have found. And so you will tend to have some lower inflation numbers attached to it, but more you'll just have price stability. Okay. Let me pause here. At the same time as, again, that we're having this debate, we get the National Banking Act of 1863 passed. So this would have been passed by Lincoln during the Civil War, as we're kind of starting to think about what does the peace look like and what do we look like when we have a united nation. The National Banking Act, again, allowed the establishment of national banks, but it did not eliminate the ability of states to also create their own banks. Now, what Lincoln and other federal government officials wanted is they wanted the national banks to seem more powerful and more sound than the state banks. But the only way you can do that is by basically making it so that a national bank is under stricter regulations, that it has to hold more reserves. And so, these banks, they want to make money. The things I just said, they have to hold more reserves or they have more regulations. That wouldn't be what banks, would choose to do, because the profit levels would be less. And so one of the things that we would see is that there would be this financial incentive. There was a perceived financial incentive to be a state bank over a national bank. So then, to sort of hobble the state banks, what the national government did was it decided to tax even higher the state banks, and that also what they wanted to do is that they wanted to make it so that that these state banks, basically, you could start to advertise that the currencies that they're issuing are not as sound. And so what you see here, and you see this here in 19.1, is you see this kind of interesting oscillation or shift from where you've got a peak here of, obviously you don't have it before 1863, so you have 0 national banks and you have over 1,500 state banks. And what you see is that up until 1870, you reach a point where the number of state banks are declining and the number of national banks are increasing. But then what we see is that in 1870, things change. After 1870, that things change. And what we see is that even though the state bank system, might have been more convenient in terms of, or cheaper to run, because of the fact that even though they had higher taxes, their reserves didn't have to be as high, and they didn't have as many regulations. The depositors reacted to wanting to do their business at national banks because the currency was perceived to be stronger. So basically, depositors voted with their pocketbook, right? And the business leader, at the end of the day, they just want to get more business. So even though it was costing them a little bit more, there was this flood to going back to having some more national banks. But now what you see as well is just you see a general increase in just the size of the banking system itself. So after 1880, what you're seeing are more state banks as well as more national banks. And that the general system is getting larger because we're seeing more assets in these national banks and more assets in these state banks. But it used to be that you had less of one and more of the other. Okay, that takes us back to the slides here. That takes us again back to this idea of, are we going to do with gold or silver? Again, the South and the West part of the United States wanted more silver. The North wanted more of a gold-based system. And so then that obviously directly influenced the election, the presidential election. And so, one thing that you get in leading up to this, in that 1896 election, would be the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act. And what the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act did is it was designed to increase the amount of silver that the government was purchasing in order to drive up its value. And what they wanted to do was, again, create some higher level of inflation. At the end of the day, you didn't get, part of the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act didn't allow for the free coinage of silver. So more silver itself wasn't coined, wasn't minted. So you didn't get the inflation that the farmers had wanted to see. So the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act had the potential to have created more inflation, but ultimately it did not. And you see this all coming to a head when you've got the financial panic in 1893. This made the recession that was being faced even deeper. So in some sense, you have a pretty severe economic depression. But then what you also see are more bank failures. And obviously, with more bank failures, the precarious state that farmers are in was made even more precarious as their banking relationships go away. Again, AI generated this, and this would make no sense at all. Again, our two candidates, the Republican, William McKinley, wants the gold standard. William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat, wants the silver standard. And part of what Bryan says in that one picture I showed you, what he wants is he wants to make this, again, a kind of a class, that you vote with your class interests. And he says this famous line of, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Right? So basically, you're being anti-worker if you're pushing for a gold standard. But McKinley did win, although he was assassinated. During the McKinley administration, as you would expect, because of who won, you get the Gold Standard Act of 1900. This would have been part of the McKinley administration. It ended the bimetallic standard that we had since the beginning of the country, right? Because we had that gold and silver standard. With the election, with the idea that elections have consequences, the fact that William McKinley won the election meant that we went just fully to having a gold standard. And what it did is it did lead to greater confidence, greater security for the US dollar. But what it also meant is that just like any commodity currency, no matter if it's gold or silver or the fur of animals, the problem with these fixed assets, this commodity currency, is that you can't increase or decrease the money supply in any dramatic way. Which again, it would be what you need to do for, which would be what you need to do once you have a, it would be what you would need to do if you had a Keynesian system and you were trying to manage the business cycle. Okay, I'm going to pause here. And so what you see, again, is that this debate over the currency is happening at the same time as we're just changing the banking system. Again, you get your first revision, or you get your first passage of the National Banking Act in 1863 with subsequent amendments, which leads to a banking system overall that's certainly cheaper to operate, but it's also a banking system that's more stable, and that's obviously going to be good for the economy. The unfortunate part to it is that while the banking system becomes more stable, the way that banking works is banking works as it has quite high positive returns to scale. And what that means for us is that you really only save a lot of money in a banking system when you have a oligopolistic structure. That would mean that you get more concentrated power among a few national banks, and that obviously can lead to financial problems that we're going to see here in a financial crisis in the early 1900s, but also leads to, for instance, the problem that we had during the 2008 financial crisis as well. And what this National Banking Act, what it does achieve, though, is also it leads to, ideally speaking, it leads to less or fewer financial and economic depressions caused by a failure of the banking system. The banking system itself should be more stable. The problem that we get is the Panic of 1907. Now, this would have been when Theodore Roosevelt was the president after McKinley was assassinated. And the problem was that there was these financial crises back in the early days started for the weirdest reasons. In this case, there was an attempt to dominate the copper market, which financially failed, and it led to a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York City. And once that pretty large trust company failed, that bank had a run, it caused other banking partners to no longer trust each other, which basically led to a rather large decline in credit, which caused a pretty severe economic recession in 1907. That exact same tale is the tale we get for the 2008 financial crisis, where you've got Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers largely failing, and it leading to other banks not trusting each other, which again gives us a pretty severe financial crisis. So the problem, though, with the 1907 panic is that we had no safety mechanisms to save the economy. Instead, what Roosevelt had to do is he had to turn to the richest person in the United States. Who is this guy right here? James Pierpont Morgan. Now, it is said he really didn't like photographs with his nose. He really didn't want his nose to be photographed. So there's not a lot of pictures of him, but this is he basically was the richest person in the world, and he had to bail out both the U.S. government during this financial panic of 1907, but the economy basically as a whole. And so Roosevelt, being this populist, Theodore Roosevelt being this person who wanted to break up monopolies, also didn't want James Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, to have as much power as he had. So once there's this investigation of the 1907 panic, what we get is the Aldrich Vreeland Act. And so what this was designed to do was it was designed to just give greater efficiency and fairness to the national banking system. What it does as well is it gives us rise to the Federal Reserve Bank that we have today. The Federal Reserve Act that we get in 1913 was to go back to this debate we had had since the beginning of the country about whether we would have a national bank. We finally get it without a short 20-year time period. We finally get a national bank created in 1913 that is called the Federal Reserve System. It issues the currency. It's a bank for banks. It's a bank for the government. And it starts to get the United States just greater respect and trust in the global financial system. The other thing that the Federal Reserve does is it preserves this faith in individual regions and this distrust that the national government would have this much power by the fact that the Federal Reserve System has 12 regional districts. And you might remember this from Econ 131. That essentially what we have in the United States are 12 districts. We're in District 12, which is based out of San Francisco. But that these districts have a pretty significant role in the formation of national banking policies. And so that's what you see here, right? That this Federal Reserve System does a really good job of balancing both those who want there to be a truly national banking system and those that have the concerns about local interests that would exist. And again, you would remember these things from when you took Econ 131 about just what how the Federal Reserve adjusts things. The other thing that's changing in this time period, right? So we've got two changes. Well, we have three total changes, and we've described two of those changes. The one change again was going from transitioning from having a bimetallic monetary system to having a gold standard, and that gets established. After McKinley wins office. Then you get the establishment of the Federal Reserve System, banking system, and you get that with Theodore Roosevelt reacting, and the Congress to some extent reacting against the fact that the richest person in the United States, J.P. Morgan, had to bail everybody out. And then the third thing that happens is something that we actually talked about earlier. And that was when we were talking about the building of the railroads, the fact that the railroads needed so much money to do this and they weren't getting a lot of help from the government. They had to issue a lot of bonds. And what this did, this issuance of bonds helped create the investment banking system in the United States. Previous to this, investment banking all occurred in Europe, and we were still kind of beholden to Europe for the financing of things. This changed by the late 19th century as the railroads kind of built in their own domestic supplies of capital. The others that would have been using this besides the railroad would be the larger manufacturers that are using this. And so a lot of this is going to be on the East Coast, which is still where the capital market is largely situated today. As we get a gold-based currency, as we get a national banking system, what you see is that the economy grows dramatically. And this economy, to continue to grow dramatically, is going to need a great deal of credit. And these investment banks are going to do that for them. The consequence of this, though, is that the domestic banking system, despite this fact it's going to have greater efficiency and in theory will have greater stability because of the Federal Reserve Act, it also, though, means that the economy is going to fluctuate a lot more with changing business conditions. I mean, that's especially the case with the fact that we have a gold standard. What do I want to make sure? Is there anything else from this part right here? No, that's largely it. Okay, so basically we've now set the stage for the financial crisis of epic proportions that we're going to face with the Great Depression. That Great Depression caused by the fact that we have a commodity-based currency, we have a relatively new national bank, and we also have investment banks out there that are doing a great deal of business, and are often doing it with in an economy that is just going to change a lot more with changing economic conditions, financial conditions. Okay.